The dust swept across the main street of Chisum Ranch, New Mexico territory, as Beatrice Hamilton clutched her worn leather satchel to her chest, containing the one book she'd managed to keep through her long journey west. The year was 1872, and while most pioneers traveled for gold, land, or escape, Beatrice had come with a different dream, entirely one that had earned her nothing but ridicule since she'd arrived 3 weeks prior. A library. Frank Dobson bellowed, his weathered face creasing with laughter as he leaned against the post outside his general store. In this God-forsaken place, might as well try growing oranges in the desert, Miss Hamilton. The townspeople's laughter stung Beatrice more than the grit in her eyes from the relentless wind. But she lifted her chin and continued toward the small room she rented above the saloon. At 24, she traveled too far and sacrificed too much to abandon her vision now, no matter how impossible it seemed to these people who had never known the transformative power of books. Inside her cramped quarters, Beatrice carefully placed her satchel on the small table and sank onto the edge of her bed. The springs creaked in protest as she removed her bonnet and released her chestnut hair from its tight bun. Her fingers traced the embroidered edges of the handkerchief she'd laid across the rough wooden table, a gift from her mother before consumption had claimed her life. The last thing her mother had whispered was to follow her dreams, no matter where they led. "I won't give up," she whispered to the empty room. "Not until every child in this town has the chance to escape through stories, just as I did." A knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. She hastily smoothed her skirts and opened the door to find Mrs. Wilkins, the saloon owner's wife, her round face flushed from climbing the stairs. "There's a gentleman asking for you downstairs, Miss Hamilton. Says he heard you're looking for a building to rent." Hope fluttered in Beatrice's chest as she followed Mrs. Wilkins down the narrow staircase. The saloon was mostly empty this early in the day, save for a few regulars nursing their morning whiskeys and a tall figure standing with his back to her, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his shoulders. "Mr. Irving," Mrs. Wilkins called out, causing the man to turn. Beatrice found herself looking up at the most striking pair of blue eyes she'd ever seen, set in a sun-bronzed face that seemed carved from the very landscape of New Mexico. His dark blonde hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and despite the dust coating his clothes, there was something undeniably dignified in his bearing. "Miss Hamilton," he said, removing his hat and revealing more of those golden curls. "Preston Irving. I understand you're aiming to start a library." His voice held no mockery, just a simple statement of fact that caught Beatrice off guard. She squared her shoulders, preparing for the inevitable laughter. "Yes, Mr. Irving, though it seems most people around here find the notion rather amusing." A hint of a smile tugged at his lips. "Most folks around here haven't had much opportunity for book learning, can't miss what you've never had." He gestured toward an empty table. "May I have a moment of your time?" Curious, Beatrice nodded and followed him, settling into the wooden chair he pulled out for her. His manners were unexpected in a town where refinement was as scarce as rainfall. "I own some property on the edge of town," Preston said, placing his hat on the table. "Empty building, sturdy foundation. Used to be a trading post before the railroad changed things. It's been sitting vacant for nearly a year now." Beatrice leaned forward, hardly daring to hope. "Are you offering to rent it to me, Mr. Irving?" "I'm offering to let you use it," he clarified. "No rent, at least not until your library gets established if it does." Her eyes narrowed. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." Preston's calloused fingers traced a pattern on the wooden table. "My mother taught me to read from one book, the Bible, before she passed. Never had the chance for more schooling myself, but I've always wondered what I missed." His eyes met hers. "A town with no books is like a well with no water. Folks might not know they're thirsty, but they are." The poetry in his words surprised her. "It won't be easy. I have very few books to start with, and I'm not sure how I'll acquire more. One thing I've learned out here, Miss Hamilton, nothing worthwhile comes easy." He stood, settling his hat back on his head. The building needs work, roof sound, but the inside needs shelves, tables. I'm handy with tools. I could help when I'm not tending to my ranch. Beatrice rose, extending her hand before she could stop herself. Why, Mr. Irving, why help a stranger with a foolish dream? His large hand enveloped hers, rough and warm. Maybe because I'd like to read a book that isn't about hellfire and damnation for once. His smile reached his eyes this time, and there's nothing foolish about bringing light to a dark place. As Preston released her hand, something inside Beatrice shifted, as if the ground beneath her feet had subtly realigned. She watched him stride out of the saloon, his tall figure silhouetted momentarily against the bright New Mexico sun before the swinging doors closed behind him. Mrs. Wilkins appeared at her side, wiping a glass with her apron. That Preston Irving's an odd one, keeps to himself mostly, runs that cattle spread north of town. Good man, though helped build the schoolhouse last year, even though he's got no children of his own. He's offered me a building, Beatrice said, still staring at the door. For the library. Mrs. Wilkins snorted. Library? You're a determined one, I'll give you that. Most young ladies come west looking for a husband, not to fill people's heads with fancy ideas. Perhaps both endeavors involve hope, Mrs. Wilkins, Beatrice replied with a small smile. And I've never been one to choose the easy path. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the sky an endless blue canopy over the rugged landscape. Beatrice had risen early, gathering her few belongings and the precious books she'd managed to bring west. 5 volumes in total, a collection of Shakespeare's works, Pride and Prejudice, Robinson Crusoe, a book of poetry by Emily Dickinson, and a well-worn copy of Little Women. Not much to start a library, but seeds for what she hoped would grow into something magnificent. Preston was waiting beside a wagon when she emerged from the saloon, looking freshly shaven but no less rugged in the morning light. You're prompt, Mr. Irving, she said, clutching her small satchel. Time's valuable out here, he replied, offering his hand to help her onto the wagon seat. Got cattle to tend to later and a fence line that won't fix itself. The ride to the edge of town took less than 10 minutes, the wagon wheels raising small clouds of dust as they traveled. Preston pointed out landmarks along the way: the smithy, the small church, the schoolhouse he'd helped build, his deep voice painting a picture of the community he clearly cared for. There it is, he finally said, pulling the horses to a stop before a square, sturdy building of adobe and stone. It stood a little apart from the other structures, with a wide porch and windows covered with wooden shutters. Not much to look at now, but it's solid. Beatrice couldn't help the smile that spread across her face. The building was perfect, spacious enough for shelves and reading tables, yet intimate enough to feel welcoming. As Preston helped her down from the wagon, their hands touched briefly, and she felt an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun. Inside, dust motes danced in the beams of light that streamed through the cracks in the shutters. The space was empty save for an old counter and some broken crates, but Beatrice could already envision rows of bookshelves, comfortable chairs, and children gathered around tables, discovering new worlds through pages. What do you think? Preston asked, his voice echoing slightly in the empty room. It's perfect, she whispered, turning in a slow circle. Absolutely perfect. He smiled, and for a moment, Beatrice caught a glimpse of what Preston Irving might have looked like as a boy before the sun and hard work had weathered his features. There was genuine pleasure in his expression, as if her joy somehow fed his own. It needs a good cleaning, she said practically, setting down her satchel. And shelves, of course, lots of shelves. Preston nodded, already measuring the walls with his eyes. I've got lumber at my ranch, could start on those shelves tomorrow if that suits you. You'd really build them yourself? Beatrice asked, surprised by his continued generosity. Said I would, didn't I? There was no offense in his tone, just simple honesty. A man's word is all he has out here. Over the next few days, Beatrice threw herself into cleaning the building. Mrs. Wilkins, surprisingly, rounded up several of the local women to help, and soon the floors were scrubbed, windows cleaned, and walls dusted. The skepticism remained in their eyes, but there was also curiosity. "Never been much of a reader myself," admitted Clara Jenkins, the blacksmith's wife, as she wrung out a cloth. "But my little Sarah, she's always making up stories. Maybe she'd like a real book." "That's exactly why this matters," Beatrice said earnestly. "For the Sarahs who hunger for stories, and for those who don't yet know what they're missing." True to his word, Preston arrived early on the fourth day with a wagon full of lumber. He worked steadily, measuring twice before cutting, his movements economical and precise. Beatrice found herself watching his hands, large and capable, yet surprisingly deft as they shaped the wood into what would become the first bookshelf. "Where did you learn carpentry?" she asked during a brief break, offering him a cup of water. Preston drank deeply before answering. "My father was a furniture maker back in Pennsylvania, taught me before he lost everything and we headed west." A shadow crossed his face. "He didn't last long out here. The desert takes those who don't bend." "Yet you remained," she observed softly, "found I belonged here more than back east." His eyes met hers. "There's a honesty to this land. It doesn't pretend to be gentle or easy, but there's beauty in its harshness." Beatrice nodded, understanding in a way she hadn't expected. "Like a difficult book that yields its treasures only to those willing to persist through the challenging passages." Preston's smile was slow but genuine. "Never thought of it that way, but yes, exactly like that." As the days passed, a rhythm developed between them. Preston would arrive at dawn, work on the shelves until midday, then return to his ranch duties. Beatrice would clean, organize, and plan, occasionally reading aloud from one of her books while Preston worked. She noticed how he would slow his hammering during these readings, his head cocked slightly as if afraid to miss a single word. Word of the library project spread through Chisum Ranch. Most still scoffed, but curiosity drew visitors, first children peering through the windows, then adults, stopping by with barely concealed interest. "What exactly do you plan to do when you've got shelves but no books to fill them?" asked Frank Dobson one afternoon, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. Before Beatrice could answer, Preston spoke up from where he was mounting a shelf. "Miss Hamilton has written to publishers back east, and I've put out word to some cattle buyers from Denver. They're bringing a crate of books next month." Beatrice stared at him in surprise. He hadn't mentioned this to her. Frank raised an eyebrow. "You're investing quite a bit in this folly, Irving." "Not a folly," Preston replied evenly. "An investment in the town's future." After Frank left, Beatrice approached Preston. "You've really arranged for books to be delivered?" He nodded, focusing on leveling a shelf. "Figured we'd need more than 5 books, no matter how good they are. My cattle broker knows some people in Denver with more books than they need." "We." She echoed softly. Preston's hands stilled and he finally looked at her. Something unspoken passed between them, a current of understanding that made Beatrice's heart beat faster. "I may not be educated, Miss Hamilton, but I know a worthy cause when I see one." He returned to his work, but not before Beatrice caught the slight flush on his tanned cheeks. That evening, as twilight settled over Chisum Ranch, Beatrice sat on the porch of her newly cleaned building, watching the stars emerge one by one. She'd never seen stars so bright like diamonds scattered across black velvet. The vastness of the sky reminded her how small her dream might seem in the grand scheme of things, yet also how important it was to reach for those distant lights. The sound of boot steps interrupted her contemplation. Preston approached, his tall figure easily recognizable even in the gathering darkness. "Finished the last shelf," he said, settling beside her on the porch step. "Thought you might want to know." "Thank you," she said simply. "Not just for the shelves, but for believing in this when no one else would." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the cooling air carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. "Why books?" Preston finally asked. "What made them so important to you?" Beatrice clasped her hands in her lap, organizing her thoughts. My father was a professor before his health failed. Our house was full of books, and when I was confined to bed with scarlet fever as a child, they became my escape. Through books, I could travel anywhere, be anyone. She smiled at the memory. After he died, we lost everything except the few books I could carry. They were my companions through every hardship. Preston nodded slowly. Never had much schooling myself. Left formal education at 10 when we headed west. Sometimes I wonder who I might have been with more learning. Impulsively, Beatrice touched his arm. It's never too late, Mr. Irving. That's the beauty of books, they wait patiently for us to find them. His eyes found hers in the darkness, and for a breathless moment, Beatrice felt as if he might say something more personal. Instead, he stood, offering his hand to help her up. It's getting late. I'll walk you back to the saloon. The next few weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Preston finished the shelves, then built a sturdy desk and several reading tables. Beatrice organized her small collection, created a lending system, and continued writing letters to publishers and libraries back east, requesting donations of books. To her surprise, responses began to arrive. A publisher in Boston promised to send 10 volumes of recent works. A retired schoolteacher in St. Louis shipped a crate containing 30 well-loved children's books. Even Frank Dobson grudgingly contributed a dusty collection of dime novels he'd accumulated over the years. Not exactly literature, he grumbled, but might get some of these cowboys interested in reading something besides wanted posters. The true turning point came when the cattle buyers Preston had mentioned arrived from Denver with not one but 3 crates of books, novels, histories, scientific texts, and poetry collections that made Beatrice weep with joy when she unpacked them. How can I ever thank you? She asked Preston as they shelved the new acquisitions together. He handled each book with careful reverence despite his large hands. Seeing your face just now is thanks enough, he said quietly. Never seen anyone so happy about a bunch of paper and ink. Not paper and ink, she corrected gently. Ideas, dreams, entire worlds, he nodded, shelving a volume of Thoreau with surprising care. Read me something you love. Beatrice selected her copy of Emily Dickinson's poems, opening to a dog-eared page. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul, she reads softly, and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. When she looked up, Preston was watching her with an expression that made her breath catch, as if she were something precious and rare that he'd discovered in this unlikeliest of places. The grand opening of the Chisum Ranch library took place on a Saturday in early October, when the summer heat had finally given way to the gentler warmth of autumn. Beatrice had hung a hand-painted sign above the door and arranged fresh wildflowers on the desk. The shelves, Preston's shelves, stood proudly against the walls, now filled with nearly 200 books, a small collection by Eastern standards, but a treasure trove in this frontier town. To Beatrice's astonishment, it seemed the entire town turned out for the occasion. Families with children, cowboys, shopkeepers, and even the town's small contingent of Chinese railroad workers crowded into the space, eyeing the books with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion. You actually did it, Mrs. Wilkins marveled, running her fingers along the spines of the books. When you first mentioned a library, I thought the desert sun had addled your brain. I had help, Beatrice replied, her eyes finding Preston across the room. He stood somewhat apart from the crowd, his tall frame leaning against the doorframe, watching the proceedings with quiet satisfaction. The school teacher, Miss Abernathy, expressed delight at having resources for her students. This will make such a difference for the children, she enthused, especially those who have never held a book before. Frank Dobson grudgingly admitted the library might not be the worst idea to hit Chisum Ranch, which from him was high praise indeed. But the moment that brought tears to Beatrice's eyes came later, when most of the crowd had dispersed. A young cowhand, barely 20 years old, approached her desk hesitantly, hat in his hands. Miss, I can't read too good, he admitted in a low voice. Never had much schooling, but I'd like to learn better. Would there be a book here that's not too hard for someone like me?" Beatrice's heart swelled as she led him to a shelf containing simpler texts. "Learning to read is like breaking a wild horse," she told him gently. "It takes patience and persistence, but the freedom it brings is worth every struggle." From across the room, she caught Preston watching this exchange, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. When their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them, a shared pride in what they had built together. That evening, after the last visitors had left and twilight settled over Chisum Ranch, Preston lingered, helping Beatrice straighten chairs and organize the few books that had been returned to the wrong shelves. "You did it," he said simply. "They came." "We did it," she corrected, touching one of the shelves he had crafted with such care. "I couldn't have done this without you, Preston." It was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it seemed to hang in the air between them, marking a shift in their relationship. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," he said, his voice deeper than usual. "Would you consider dining with me tomorrow evening at my ranch? Nothing formal, but I'd like to show you the place." Beatrice felt a blush rising to her cheeks. "I'd like that very much." The following evening, Preston arrived in a freshly polished wagon to collect Beatrice. He wore a clean shirt and had tamed his usual windswept hair, though a few golden strands still escaped to curl at his collar. Beatrice had spent more time than she cared to admit preparing for the evening, finally settling on her best blue dress, the color. Mrs. Wilkins had informed her with a knowing smile. That best matched her eyes. "You look lovely," Preston said as he helped her into the wagon, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary. The drive to his ranch took them through rolling grasslands that glowed golden in the setting sun. Beatrice had never ventured this far from town, and she drank in the beauty of the landscape, the distant purple mountains, the scattered juniper trees, and the occasional cattle grazing peacefully on the autumn-cured grass. Preston's ranch was modest but well-maintained, with a sturdy main house built of local stone and timber. A bunkhouse for his few hands stood nearby, along with a barn and corral. What caught Beatrice's attention, however, was the small garden beside the house, bursting with late-season vegetables and bordered by carefully tended flowers. "Not what you expected from a bachelor's quarters?" Preston asked, noting her surprise. "It's beautiful," she replied honestly. "It feels like a home, not just a house." Inside, the main room was dominated by a stone fireplace where a welcoming blaze already danced. The furnishings were simple but well-crafted: a table and chairs, a comfortable-looking sofa, and bookshelves built into the walls on either side of the fireplace. Beatrice couldn't hide her surprise at the sight of the books. Not many, perhaps 30 volumes in all, but more than she would have expected. Preston followed her gaze, a slight flush coloring his tanned face. "Been collecting them whenever I could. Mostly practical things: animal husbandry, botany, some history, nothing fancy like your poetry." "They're wonderful," she said sincerely, running her fingers along the spines. Dinner was simple but delicious: roast beef, potatoes from his garden, fresh bread that Preston admitted sheepishly had been baked by his ranch cook, and berry pie for dessert. As they ate, conversation flowed easily between them, touching on books they'd read, places they'd seen, and dreams they still harbored. "I never asked what brought you west," Preston said as they lingered over coffee. "Most young ladies don't travel alone to frontier towns to start libraries." Beatrice's fingers tightened around her cup. "After my father died, there wasn't much left for me in Boston. My mother's sister offered to take me in, but her husband made it clear I was an unwelcome burden. I had a small inheritance enough to get me west and start something new." She smiled sadly. "I suppose I could have stayed and eventually married some merchant or clerk, but I wanted more, needed more. Freedom," Preston said, understanding in his eyes. "The same thing that draws most people west." "Yes, but not just that. Purpose." She met his gaze steadily. "I wanted to build something meaningful. When I read about these frontier towns with no access to books or education, I knew where I belonged. Preston nodded slowly. Most folks come west looking to take something: gold, land, opportunities. You came to give something. That's rare. After dinner, they settled before the fire, the conversation turning to Preston's own journey west, the loss of his parents, his struggles to establish the ranch, and the slow, hard-won respect he'd earned in Chisum Ranch. It wasn't easy, he admitted. For years, it was just me and the cattle and more work than daylight to do it in. There were times I nearly gave up. What kept you going? Beatrice asked softly, Preston's eyes, reflecting the firelight, turned to her. Stubbornness, mostly. And the belief that I was building something worthwhile, something that might last beyond me. His voice lowered. Though I admit, there were lonely times when I wondered what it was all for. The vulnerability in his admission touched Beatrice deeply. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the sofa between them. His skin was warm, roughened by years of labor, but his touch was gentle as he turned his palm up to clasp her fingers. I understand loneliness, she said softly. Even surrounded by books and stories, there were times when I yearned for someone real to share them with. The moment stretched between them, fragile and precious. Then Preston leaned forward, slowly enough that she could have pulled away if she wished. Instead, Beatrice closed the distance between them, her heart racing as his lips met hers in a tender, questioning kiss. When they parted, his eyes searched hers. I've wanted to do that since the day you read that poem about hope, he confessed. Beatrice smiled, her cheeks warm. I've wanted you to since that same day. The ride back to town was quiet, a comfortable silence wrapping around them like a shared blanket. Preston's arm occasionally brushed against hers as he guided the horses, each touch sending a pleasant shiver through her despite the warmth of the evening. At the door to her room above the saloon, he kissed her again, more confidently this time, his hand cradling her cheek with infinite tenderness. Good night, Beatrice, he whispered against her hair. Thank you for sharing your evening with me. Good night, Preston, she replied, reluctant to see him go but glowing with the promise of more evenings to come. As autumn deepened into winter, the library became the heart of Chisum Ranch. Children came after school for story hours that Beatrice conducted, their faces alight with wonder as she introduced them to far-off lands and fantastical creatures. Adults began to visit too, first the women, seeking recipes and household advice from the domestic manuals, then gradually the men, sheepishly requesting farming guides or history books about the Civil War. Preston became a regular fixture, stopping by almost daily to check on repairs, bring new books he'd acquired through his cattle buyers, or simply to spend time with Beatrice. Their courtship progressed steadily, with rides across the ranch lands, dinners at his home, and long conversations by the library fire after closing time. Word of Chisum Ranch's library spread to neighboring settlements. Occasionally, families would travel for hours just to borrow books or listen to Beatrice read aloud. She began to offer reading lessons twice weekly, and to her delight, the young cowhand who had approached her on opening day proved to be one of her most dedicated students. You've changed this place, Preston told her one evening as they walked along the main street, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. There's a hunger for knowledge that wasn't here before. The hunger was always there, she corrected gently. People just needed someone to show them the feast. Not everyone embraced the library, of course. Some of the older ranchers viewed books with suspicion, seeing them as useless distractions from the practical business of survival. Others objected to particular titles. A controversy erupted when Beatrice added Darwin's On the Origin of Species to the collection, leading to a heated town meeting where she staunchly defended the right to read diverse viewpoints. Knowledge isn't dangerous, she argued passionately. Ignorance is. To her surprise, it was Frank Dobson who finally supported her. Don't much care for that evolution nonsense myself, he drawled, but reckon folks ought to make up their own minds. That's the American way, ain't it? The matter was settled when Preston quietly donated funds for religious texts to balance the collection, demonstrating once again his diplomatic understanding of the community's needs. As Christmas approached, Beatrice worked with the schoolchildren to decorate the library with paper chains and pinecone ornaments. Preston arrived one morning with a small pine tree he'd cut from his land, setting it up in the corner where the children could adorn it with their handmade decorations. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small package wrapped in brown paper. "An early Christmas gift." Inside, Beatrice found a beautiful bookmark crafted from tooled leather, with her initials and a small image of an open book pressed into the surface. "Preston, it's exquisite," she breathed, running her fingers over the detailed work. "Made it myself," he admitted, a hint of pride in his voice. "Thought you could use something special to mark your place." Impulsively, she rose on her tiptoes to kiss him, heedless of the giggling children decorating nearby. "Thank you. It's perfect." On Christmas Eve, the library hosted a special reading of A Christmas Carol with hot cider and cookies contributed by the townswomen. The building was packed with families, the children sitting cross-legged on the floor while their parents occupied every available chair. Beatrice read with animation, giving each character a distinct voice that had the children shrieking with delight at her impression of Scrooge and the adults nodding in recognition at the timeless story. Preston sat at the back, his tall frame too large for the children's chairs, his eyes never leaving Beatrice as she wove the tale of redemption and second chances. After the final, "God bless us, everyone," and the applause that followed, the families gradually dispersed into the cold, clear night, leaving Preston and Beatrice alone in the library. The lamplight cast a golden glow over the room, the shadows of the Christmas tree stretching across the floor. "You were magnificent," Preston said, helping her collect the empty cider cups. "I've never heard that story before, but I don't think I'll ever forget it now." "It's about transformation," Beatrice replied, straightening a row of books that tiny hands had left askew. "About finding your heart again after it's grown cold and hard." Preston set down the cups he was gathering and turned to her, his expression suddenly serious. "Beatrice, I need to ask you something." Her heart quickened at his tone. "Yes." He took her hands in his blue eyes intense in the lamplight. "Before you came to Chisum Ranch, I was, not unlike Scrooge in some ways, not miserly perhaps, but solitary. Focused only on work, on building the ranch. I'd forgotten what it was to dream beyond the next season, the next cattle drive." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, sending warmth up her arm. "You've shown me there's more to life than just survival. You've given this whole town a gift, but you've given me something even greater, a reason to look forward to each day." Beatrice felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes as Preston continued. "I know it's fast we've known each other only a few months, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring, a delicate sapphire set in silver. "Beatrice Hamilton, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Joy bubbled up within her, as bright and unstoppable as a desert spring after rainfall. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Preston, yes, I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "It was my mother's," he explained. "The only thing of value she brought west. She'd be proud to see it on your hand." Their kiss was deeper now, filled with promise and shared dreams. When they finally parted, both breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Beatrice. For your courage, your determination, your compassion. For bringing books to a bookless town, and for bringing light back into my life." "And I love you, Preston Irving," she replied, her voice steady despite the tears of joy threatening to spill. "For believing in an impossible dream, for building shelves when others only laughed, and for showing me that some stories are meant to be lived, not just read." News of their engagement spread through Chisum Ranch like wildfire, met with general approval and only a few cynical wagers on how long the bookish Eastern woman would last as a rancher's wife. Mrs. Wilkins organized an impromptu celebration at the saloon, where even the most hardened cowboys offered awkward congratulations and sage marital advice that made Beatrice blush. "You've done well for yourself, Irving," Frank Dobson declared, clapping Preston on the shoulder. "Smartest woman in the territory, and the prettiest too, if you don't mind my saying so." Preston's arm tightened around Beatrice's waist. "Don't mind you saying what's plainly true, Frank." The wedding was planned for early April, when the worst of winter would be past, but before the demanding spring cattle work began. In the meantime, Beatrice divided her time between the library and learning the basics of ranch management from Preston. He, in turn, spent his evenings at the library, gradually working his way through the classics under Beatrice's guidance, his natural intelligence making up for his limited formal education. "I never thought Romeo and Juliet would interest me," he admitted one night as they sat before the fire in his ranch house. "But there's something powerful about Shakespeare's language, even when I have to read passages 3 times to understand them." "It's music in words," Beatrice agreed, leaning against his shoulder. "Though I hope our own love story ends more happily than theirs." Preston chuckled, pressing a kiss to her hair. "I promise not to drink any poison, no matter how dire the circumstances." As winter gradually released its grip on the land, Preston began building an addition to his ranch house, a spacious room with windows on 3 sides to catch the light, with built-in bookshelves lining every available wall space. "Your library," he explained when he first showed Beatrice the partially constructed room. "So you can have your books at home too." She was touched beyond words by his thoughtfulness, by how completely he had embraced her passion for books and learning. What had started as support for her dream had become a shared vision not just for the public library in town, but for a home filled with stories and ideas. The wedding day dawned clear and mild, the New Mexico sky a perfect blue canopy over the small white church. Beatrice wore a simple gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Wilkins had helped her sew, with a crown of spring wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Preston, standing tall and handsome at the altar in a new black suit, watched her walk down the aisle with an expression of such unguarded adoration that several of the townswomen dabbed at their eyes. Their vows were traditional, but spoken with heartfelt conviction. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Preston's kiss was both tender and possessive, a promise of the life they would build together. The townspeople cheered as they emerged from the church into the bright April sunshine, showering them with flower petals and good wishes. The celebration afterward was held at the library Preston's suggestion, which had delighted Beatrice. Tables had been moved outside to the newly constructed porch, laden with food contributed by every household in Chisum Ranch. Music from fiddles and guitars filled the air as people danced, ate, and toasted the couple who had, in their different ways, enriched the community. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, Beatrice found a moment of quiet with her new husband, standing slightly apart from the festivities. "Happy?" Preston asked, his arm around her waist. "Completely," she answered, leaning into his embrace. "Though I still can't quite believe how fortunate I am. When I came west with my crazy dream of a library, I never imagined I'd find someone like you. Someone who can't tell Dickens from Twain," he teased. "Someone who would build shelves instead of barriers," she corrected softly. "Someone who could see the value in what others dismissed." Preston's expression grew serious. "I saw the value in you, Beatrice, from that first day, your determination, your passion, the way you refused to give up no matter how many people laughed." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I may not have had much schooling, but I know a treasure when I see one." As the celebration continued around them, Beatrice reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The grief of losing her parents, the uncertainty of traveling west alone, the skepticism she'd faced upon arrival all had led her to this unexpected happiness. This man who had become not just her husband but her partner in building something meaningful. What are you thinking?" Preston asked, noting her contemplative expression. Beatrice smiled up at him. "That sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones we never saw coming." In the years that followed, the library at Chisum Ranch continued to grow and thrive under Beatrice's guidance. Preston expanded the building twice to accommodate the increasing collection, which swelled with donations from back east and purchases made possible by a small grant from the territorial government. The Irving Ranch prospered as well, with Preston's careful management and Beatrice's surprisingly practical contributions to the business side of cattle raising. They complemented each other perfectly, his hands-on experience balanced by her research and organizational skills, her visionary ideas grounded by his pragmatic approach. Their first child, a son they named James after Preston's father, was born a year after their wedding. He grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's love of books. By the time he was 4, he could often be found helping at the library, solemnly shelving books or sitting on the reading rug with the other children during story time. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Eleanor, who inherited Preston's golden curls and Beatrice's determined spirit. From her earliest days, she showed a particular affinity for the outdoors, following her father around the ranch and insisting on having stories read to her under the big cottonwood tree rather than indoors. Life wasn't without challenges. Drought struck the territory hard in 1879, forcing Preston to sell off half his herd to survive. The following year, scarlet fever swept through Chisum Ranch, claiming several lives, including that of the young cowhand who had become one of Beatrice's most dedicated reading students. The library closed for a month during the outbreak, reopening with a new section dedicated to medical texts that Beatrice had specifically requested from publishers back east. Through it all, Preston and Beatrice faced each challenge together, their partnership growing stronger with each passing season. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, they would often sit in the library room Preston had built in their home, reading aloud to each other or simply enjoying the comfortable silence of two people wholly at ease in each other's company. On the 10th anniversary of the library's opening, the town of Chisum Ranch, now grown large enough to be properly called a town, with a mayor and a town council, held a celebration in Beatrice's honor. The library, once dismissed as a foolish dream, had become the pride of the community, with over 2,000 volumes and a reputation that drew visitors from as far away as Santa Fe. "I want to thank you all for coming today," Beatrice said, addressing the crowd gathered in front of the expanded library building. "But more importantly, I want to thank you for proving that books and learning have a place even in the harshest frontier." She paused, her eyes finding Preston's in the crowd, drawing strength from his proud smile. 10 years ago, many of you laughed when I proposed a library for Chisum Ranch. It seemed an impractical dream in a place where survival itself was often in question. Frank Dobson, now the mayor, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, remembering his own skepticism. "But one person didn't laugh," Beatrice continued, her voice warming. "One person saw possibility where others saw folly. My husband, Preston Irving, didn't just believe in my dream, he built the shelves to hold it." Preston ducked his head slightly at the public praise, though the pride in his eyes was unmistakable. "This library isn't just my achievement," Beatrice concluded. "It belongs to all of us, to everyone who donated books, who attended readings, who learned to read here, and who discovered that knowledge and imagination are as essential to a community as water and bread. Thank you for allowing me to bring my dream to Chisum Ranch, and for making it your own." The applause was thunderous, led by James and Eleanor, who jumped up and down in their excitement, causing general laughter. After the ceremony, as the townspeople enjoyed cake and punch on the library lawn, Preston found a moment alone with his wife. "Proud of you," he said simply, his hand finding hers. "Always have been." Beatrice squeezed his fingers. We built this together, Preston. Everything good in my life came from that first day you offered to help a stubborn Easterner with an impossible dream." He smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening with the years they'd shared. Not impossible, as it turns out, just waiting for the right person to make it happen. As the sun began to set over Chisum Ranch, casting long shadows across the land they both loved, Beatrice leaned her head against Preston's shoulder, watching their children racing across the library lawn with the other town children. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come to find me that day?" she asked softly. "If you hadn't offered your building or built those first shelves," Preston's arm tightened around her. "No need to wonder. Some things are meant to be, Beatrice. Like books finding their readers or two people finding each other against all odds." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "And our story's still being written one day at a time." In the warm glow of the setting sun, surrounded by the community they'd helped build and the family they'd created together, Beatrice knew he was right. Their love story, like the library that had brought them together, had grown from the unlikeliest beginnings into something enduring and beautiful. And like the best books on their shelves, it was a story worth returning to, page after page, chapter after chapter, as the years continued to unfold.